Our bloodline will end in less than 20 years, the system announced, and the room did something rare. It hesitated. The council chamber of Valen Prime was built to outlast wars, its walls layered with adaptive alloys that hummed softly like a patient machine thinking too far ahead. But even it seemed to hold its breath as the projection hovered in the center, cold and precise, counting down a future no one wanted to acknowledge. Commanders spoke first, as they always did, offering strength as if strength alone could repair something that had already begun to fracture, while scientists followed with careful language and carefully limited hope, their data scrolling in quiet defeat across the air like apologies no one believed. At the center of it all, Commander Saris Valen did not move. She sat with one hand resting against the arm of her chair, posture perfectly aligned, long silver-toned ears angled forward just enough to signal attention, not emotion, because emotion was inefficient in moments like this. "You are all describing the problem," she said finally, her voice calm in a way that made the room quieter rather than louder. "Not the solution." The projection shifted at her command, thousands of profiles collapsing into ordered lines of probability, compatibility, survivability, each one failing in some quiet, inconvenient way that statistics could not hide. The strongest warriors showed instability. The most intelligent candidates lacked resilience. The bloodlines that once carried the empire now thinned into something fragile, something temporary. Saris watched it all without visible reaction, though her fingers paused once, just briefly, as if the data had brushed against something personal and decided not to linger. "Show me anomalies," she said. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible delay that suggested it did not approve of the request, then complied. A single file expanded at the edge of the display, smaller than the rest, as though it did not belong in the same category. Ethan Cole. Human. No royal lineage. No strategic designation. No reason to be here. Saris leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between herself and the data, and the chamber lights adjusted instinctively, narrowing their focus, as if even the architecture understood that something had shifted. Mission logs unfolded one after another. Not victories, not domination, but survival, extraction, impossible consistency where randomness should have ruled. 17 operations in. Contested zones. 0 losses. Notes appended in dry, almost careless language about structural faults and supply inefficiencies, as if the preservation of life were a side effect rather than the objective. Her ears stilled completely. "Run compatibility," she said. The system complied, and for the first time since the meeting began, it raised a warning. Not failure, not rejection, something else. Match detected with legacy architecture. It reported, its tone unchanged, but its presence heavier now, as if the room itself were listening more carefully. Legacy architecture. Ancient systems no longer understood, technology that responded only to bloodlines thought extinct or irrelevant. Saris did not look away from the file. She did not ask how. She did not question why. She simply watched the numbers align in a way they were not supposed to, watched the impossible settle into something disturbingly consistent. Around her, the council shifted, sensing the change without understanding it, like a room noticing the pressure drop before a storm. "Commander," one of the advisors began cautiously, "the human is statistically insignificant." Saris straightened, the movement small but decisive, like a lock engaging. "No," she said quietly. "He is not." The projection dimmed around every other candidate, leaving only one name illuminated in steady, undeniable light. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she said nothing at all, just stood there with the weight of a decision forming in the silence, precise and irreversible, as if it had been waiting longer than anyone realized. Then she spoke, and the chamber listened. No one spoke immediately, which was impressive considering the number of people whose entire careers depended on having something to say. The projection remained suspended in the center of the chamber, Ethan Cole's name steady and unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered, and Saris let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, because discomfort revealed more truth than arguments ever did. One advisor shifted his stance, another adjusted a data slate that did not need adjusting, and somewhere along the curved edge of the room, a junior analyst swallowed hard enough for the sound to register in the quiet. "Run it again," Sarah said, not because she doubted the result, but because repetition forced the system to commit. The data recalculated with quiet efficiency, layers of compatibility metrics folding over each other like a machine attempting to explain something it did not entirely understand. The warning appeared again, identical in timing, identical in tone. Not error, not rejection, recognition. Sarah's gaze did not flicker. "Explain the match," she said. The system hesitated for a measurable fraction of a second, long enough that several heads turned toward the projection as if it might suddenly develop a personality and apologize. Human subject Ethan Cole demonstrates adaptive resilience patterns consistent with archived royal genome markers, it reported. A pause, then more carefully, probability exceeds expected variance. One of the senior geneticists let out a controlled breath. "That is not possible," he said, which was less a statement of fact and more a request for the universe to reconsider. Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the comment without granting it authority. "And yet," she said, the chamber shifted again, not physically, but in the way attention reoriented itself, like gravity deciding to favor a different direction. "We are discussing statistical noise," another council member added, voice measured, cautious. "A human anomaly does not justify." "Justify what?" Sarah interrupted, her tone still even, still calm, but now carrying an edge so fine it did not need volume to cut. The council member stopped mid-sentence, which was rare enough to be noted. Sarah stepped down from the raised platform, the floor adjusting subtly beneath her boots as if anticipating her movement, and crossed the space between herself and the projection with unhurried precision. Up close, the data reflected faintly in her eyes, lines of probability and history and quiet impossibility layered over something far more decisive. "You are attempting to preserve a system that is already failing," she said. "I am attempting to replace it." That landed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet weight of something that did not require agreement to be true. She lifted a hand, expanding Ethan's file further, revealing the details the system had not prioritized. Not victories, but choices. Not dominance, but restraint. Reports of evacuations completed under pressure. Notes about structural weaknesses corrected after the fact. A pattern of decisions that favored continuity over display. "He does not pursue recognition," Sarah said softly, almost to herself. "He produces it." The geneticist frowned, confusion threading through his certainty. "Commander, even if the compatibility holds, integration across species lines would require time," Sarah finished. "And adaptation." She turned then, finally facing the full council, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled, but something in the air had already shifted beyond reversal. "We do not have the luxury of waiting for ideal conditions," she continued. "We have one viable path. It is not perfect. It is not expected. It is not negotiable." The last words settled into the chamber with a finality that made further objections feel less like disagreement and more like delay. Somewhere behind her, the projection brightened slightly, as if the system itself had accepted the direction and was preparing for what came next. Sarah allowed a single breath, measured and precise, then spoke again, her voice carrying not just across the room, but through it, as though the walls themselves were now part of the decision. "Initiate retrieval," she said. "Bring the human to me." 3 hours later, Ethan Cole was arguing with a maintenance drone that had developed what he suspected was a personality flaw. "You cannot just realign the stabilizer coil by guessing," he said, lying on his back beneath a transport shuttle that had seen better decades, its metal hull radiating just enough residual heat to make the job uncomfortable without being dramatic about it. The drone emitted a soft, defensive tone. "That was not guessing," it replied. "That was predictive adjustment." Ethan slid the wrench out from a tight angle and stared up at the underside of the shuttle as if it might apologize. "You predicted wrong," he said. A small drop of coolant landed directly on his collar. He paused. "And now you are leaking on me, which I am choosing to take personally." Around him, Dock 12 moved at its usual pace, which was to say organized chaos with good lighting. Cargo units drifted along guided tracks, workers moved in practiced patterns, and somewhere a public announcement politely reminded everyone that safety protocols were not optional, even if they felt that way. Ethan preferred this environment. Systems made sense. If something failed, you found the problem, fixed it, and moved on. There were no councils, no projections predicting the end of anything important. Just machines that needed attention and people who occasionally listened. Lieutenant Ethan Cole, a voice said from somewhere above him, precise in a way that suggested it had been trained not to improvise. Ethan froze for half a second, then glanced to his left, then his right, as if there might be another Ethan Cole conveniently available to take responsibility. That depends, he replied, still on his back. Is this about the coffee requisition report? Because I stand by my position. A few nearby workers slowed just enough to listen without appearing to listen, which was a skill Ethan respected. He slid out from under the shuttle and sat up, wiping his hands on a cloth that had given up on being clean years ago. Standing at the edge of the maintenance bay was a man in formal attire that did not belong in Dock 12, flanked by two silent escort units bearing an unfamiliar insignia that somehow felt important even if Ethan could not immediately place it. The man inclined his head slightly. "Lieutenant Ethan Cole," he repeated. "You are to come with us." Ethan blinked once. "That sounds official," he said, which is rarely good news. The envoy did not smile, though something in his expression suggested he understood the concept. "You have been requested by Commander Saris Valen," he said. The name landed with a weight that did not match Ethan's current understanding of his own day. He reached for his jacket slowly, buying himself a few seconds to process the sentence in a way that might rearrange it into something more reasonable. It did not cooperate. "Requested," Ethan echoed. "That feels like a strong word." "It is," the envoy replied. Around them, the dock had gone quieter, not silent, but attentive, like a system recalibrating. Ethan slipped his arms into his jacket, fingers pausing briefly at the cuff as his mind ran through possibilities and rejected all of them. He had not done anything notable. He had not broken anything important. He had certainly not interacted with anyone who would justify formal attire showing up in a place where most problems were solved with a wrench and a good attitude. "All right," he said finally, because refusing a sentence like that felt inefficient. "Hypothetically, if I say no." The envoy met his gaze without hesitation. "That would be noted," he said. Ethan nodded once. "That is exactly as comforting as I expected." He glanced back at the shuttle, then at the drone hovering nearby, which seemed quietly pleased with how events were unfolding. "Do not touch anything while I am gone," he told it. The drone emitted a tone that might have been agreement or sarcasm. Ethan chose not to investigate further. As he stepped away from the maintenance bay, the weight of the request settled in more firmly, not heavy, but precise, like a measurement he had not realized was being taken. Somewhere far above Dock 12, unseen and inevitable, a decision had already been made, and for reasons that did not yet make sense, it had his name attached to it. The transport did not make a sound when it arrived, which Ethan decided was either very advanced engineering or a deliberate design choice meant to make people nervous. He stood at the edge of the landing platform with his jacket still carrying the faint scent of coolant and metal, watching a craft descend with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested it had never once questioned its own purpose. The envoy gestured politely, and Ethan followed because at this point curiosity had overtaken caution, which he recognized as a personal flaw, but not one he was particularly motivated to correct. Inside, the air was cooler, cleaner, and carried a faint hum that reminded him of systems running at a level most people were not meant to notice. He took a seat that adjusted itself slightly as he settled, which he chose to interpret as hospitality rather than surveillance. "Do I get a briefing?" he asked, glancing at the envoy. "Or are we embracing mystery as a strategy?" The envoy's expression remained composed. "You will be informed upon arrival," he said. Ethan nodded once. "That sounds like a no with extra steps." The transport lifted without ceremony, the city below shrinking into ordered lines of light and motion, and for a moment Ethan found himself staring out at a view he had never planned to see, the kind of perspective that made everything look simpler than it actually was. He rested his arm against the side panel and exhaled slowly, his mind running through possibilities again and discarding each one with increasing efficiency. None of them explained why someone like him had been pulled out of Dock 12, and placed into a situation that clearly belonged to someone else. The journey was not long, though it felt measured, as if time itself had decided to move carefully. When the transport descended again, it did so into a structure that made the dockyard look like a collection of good intentions. The architecture rose in smooth, deliberate curves, surfaces shifting subtly as if responding to something deeper than gravity, and the scale of it all carried a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. Ethan stepped out and paused for half a second, just enough to take it in without appearing impressed, which he considered a professional skill. "All right," he murmured under his breath. "This is definitely not about coffee." The envoy led him through a series of corridors that seemed to anticipate their path, lights adjusting, doors opening without visible command, the entire environment behaving like a system that had already decided where he belonged. People moved around them with purpose, their attention carefully directed elsewhere, though Ethan could feel the awareness in the air, the subtle shift of focus that followed them without being acknowledged. It was not hostile. It was precise. Eventually, they reached a set of doors that did not open immediately. They waited, which Ethan found more unsettling than if they had simply refused. "I assume this is the part where I reconsider my life choices," he said lightly. The envoy almost smiled. Almost. The doors parted with a soft, controlled motion, revealing a chamber that felt less like a room and more like a decision already made. At the far end, elevated but not distant, stood Commander Saris Valen. She did not move when he entered. She did not need to. The space arranged itself around her presence in a way that made everything else feel temporary by comparison. Ethan stopped a few steps inside, instinctively aware that this was not a place where casual movement improved outcomes. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was structured, deliberate, like a pause in a conversation that had not yet started. Saris studied him with a focus that felt less like judgment and more like verification, her gaze steady, her posture composed, her long silver-toned ears angled forward in quiet attention. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, then decided against speaking first, which for him qualified as restraint. Finally, she inclined her head a fraction. "Ethan Cole," she said, his name precise in her voice, as if it had already been tested for accuracy. He nodded once. "That is what I have been told," he replied. Something in the room changed, subtle but undeniable, like a system recognizing a correct input. Sarah stepped down from her position, closing the distance between them with measured certainty, and stopped just far enough away to make the space intentional. "You have been brought here," she said, "because you meet a requirement no one else does." Ethan considered that for a moment, then let out a quiet breath. "I was not aware I was applying for anything," he said. Her expression did not soften, but something in her gaze shifted, a micro-adjustment that suggested interest rather than dismissal. "You were not," she replied. Another pause, longer this time, as if the room itself were preparing for what came next. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, absolute, and entirely without hesitation. "You will remain." The words settled into the room with a kind of quiet finality that did not invite negotiation, and Ethan found himself studying Saris Valen not as someone issuing an order, but as someone describing a fact that had already happened somewhere else. He shifted his weight slightly, more out of habit than defiance, and let out a slow breath. "That is a very confident sentence," he said, his tone even, edged with the kind of dry humor that usually helped him survive conversations that were slightly above his pay grade. "I assume there is more context." Saris regarded him without interruption, her gaze steady in a way that made it clear she was not evaluating his reaction, but confirming it. "There is," she said. The chamber responded to her voice with a subtle shift in light, projections unfolding around them in layered arcs of data that moved with quiet precision, as if the information had been waiting for this exact moment to exist. Ethan glanced at the display, then back at her, then back at the display again, the sequence suggesting he was attempting to decide which of the two was more likely to explain what was happening. "This feels like the part where I discover I have accidentally done something impressive," he said. "Which would be new?" Saris extended a hand slightly, and one section of the projection expanded, isolating a sequence of patterns that meant nothing to Ethan at first glance, but carried the unmistakable tone of importance. "Your biological profile," she said, demonstrates compatibility with systems that no longer respond to our own. Ethan stared at the data for a moment, then tilted his head just enough to acknowledge the sentence without fully accepting it. I fix engines, he said. Occasionally I fill out reports that no one reads. I do not usually activate ancient systems. And yet, Saris replied, her tone unchanged. The phrase lingered in the air between them, simple, unembellished, and entirely sufficient. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation was not going to return to anything familiar. He stepped a little closer to the projection, not out of confidence, but because standing too far away felt less productive. All right, he said. Let us assume for a moment that your system is correct, which I am sure it believes very strongly. What exactly does compatibility mean in this context? Saris did not answer immediately. She watched him instead, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, as if she were measuring not his words, but the space between them. Then she spoke. It means, she said, that your presence stabilizes what is currently unstable. Ethan blinked once. That is broader than I expected. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement that the situation had officially moved beyond anything he could categorize. You are telling me I am structurally useful, he added. That is one way to describe it, Saris said. The projection shifted again, this time revealing a timeline, a sequence of projections extending forward in clean, unforgiving lines. Ethan followed it with his eyes, the meaning becoming clear in increments rather than all at once. This is a forecast, he said. Yes. And the forecast is not good. No. He let out a quiet breath, nodding once as if the honesty deserved recognition. I appreciate the clarity, he said. It is refreshing. Saris stepped closer, closing the remaining distance with a precision that felt intentional, not invasive. And for a brief moment Ethan became acutely aware of the contrast between them, not just in status, but in certainty. She did not hesitate. She did not adjust. She simply existed in a state of decision that did not require reinforcement. There is one viable solution, she said. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the projection, then back again, the pattern repeating as if his brain were attempting to triangulate the least alarming interpretation. I have a feeling I am not going to like where this is going, he said. Saris's expression did not change, but something in her gaze sharpened, focus narrowing to a single, precise point. Your preference is not a factor, she said calmly. The room stilled, not dramatically, but completely, as if even the ambient systems had chosen to wait. Ethan considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod, more thoughtful than resistant. That is also very clear, he replied. Saris inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the exchange as complete. Then, without raising her voice, without adding emphasis, she delivered the next sentence with the same quiet certainty that had defined everything she had said so far. You will be integrated into the royal line. Silence followed, immediate and absolute, the kind that did not need explanation to carry weight. And for the first time since he had stepped into the chamber, Ethan did not respond right away, not because he lacked words, but because he was taking a moment to confirm that he had heard them correctly. For a moment, the sentence did not feel real, which Ethan decided was a reasonable reaction given that nothing about the last 15 minutes had followed a logical progression he recognized. He looked at Saris, then at the projection, then back at her again, as if the answer might be hiding somewhere between the two. Integrated, he repeated slowly, testing the word like a component that might not fit. That is a very efficient way of describing something that sounds significantly more complicated. Saris did not move. She did not clarify. She simply waited, the silence around her precise and unhurried, as if time itself had been instructed not to rush this part. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, leaving a faint streak of grease he had missed earlier, and let out a quiet breath that carried equal parts disbelief and reluctant acceptance. All right, he said finally. Let me make sure I am following correctly. Your system says I am compatible with something important. Your projections say your future is not stable, and your solution is to involve me in a way that sounds very permanent. Correct, Saris said. The simplicity of the confirmation did not help. Ethan nodded once, slowly, the motion less about agreement and more about keeping his thoughts in order. You understand that from my perspective, he said. This is the part where I ask several questions, most of which I am fairly certain you are not interested in. Answering. A faint shift touched Saris's expression, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, like the recognition of a pattern she had anticipated. You may ask, she said. Ethan considered that for a moment, then chose his starting point carefully. Why me, he asked. Not dramatic, not defensive, just direct. Saris's gaze did not waver. Because you meet the requirement, she replied. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a quiet acknowledgement that the answer was both complete and entirely insufficient. That is technically an explanation, he said. It is also remarkably unhelpful. He gestured lightly toward the projection. There are billions of people in known space. Statistically, someone else should be able to fill this role without disrupting their schedule quite as much as mine is currently being disrupted. There is no one else, Saris said. The words landed with a clarity that did not invite further statistical debate. Ethan paused, then nodded once, absorbing that in a way that felt more serious than anything that had come before. All right, he said quietly. That is less comforting than I would prefer. The chamber remained still, the projections continuing their silent work around them, data flowing in controlled patterns that suggested the decision had already been processed and filed somewhere beyond discussion. Ethan glanced at the timeline again, then back at Saris, and something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to signal that he had moved from disbelief into something more practical. What does this actually involve, he asked. Saris stepped slightly to the side, and the projection responded instantly, isolating a new sequence, one that carried less abstraction and more definition. You will be formally bound to the royal lineage, she said. Your genetic compatibility will be integrated into succession protocols. Ethan listened, his expression steady, his mind translating each phrase into something he could work with, like converting an unfamiliar system into familiar terms. So this is not a temporary assignment, he said. No, and it is not optional. No, he nodded again, slower this time, as if each confirmation was settling into place one layer at a time. That is consistent, he admitted. A brief silence followed, but it was different now, less uncertain, more focused, like the moment after a diagnosis when the conversation shifts from what is happening to what comes next. Ethan looked at Saris, really looked at her, taking in the precision of her posture, the certainty in her gaze, the absence of hesitation that made everything she said feel less like a proposal and more like a fixed point. You are very certain about this, he said. Yes. You did not consider alternatives. I did, and rejected them. Yes. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and a concession. Of course you did, he said. The words were not sarcastic. They were simply accurate. He glanced down briefly, then back up, his expression settling into something calmer, more grounded, the kind of look he wore when a system broke, and he accepted that fixing it was now his responsibility, whether he had planned for it or not. All right, he said. Then I suppose the next question is not whether this is happening. He paused, just long enough to make the shift clear. It is how. Saris inclined her head slightly, a precise acknowledgement that the conversation had reached the correct point. The ceremony will be prepared, she said. And for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan understood that whatever this was, it was already moving forward with or without his comfort, and the only thing left to decide was how he would stand inside it. The word ceremony did not echo, but it lingered in a way that made the air feel slightly more structured, as if the room had quietly adjusted itself to accommodate a future that had already been scheduled. Ethan did not respond immediately. He looked past Saris for a moment, not at anything specific, just at the space beyond her, the architecture that seemed to observe rather than exist, and he let out a slow breath that carried the faint weight of recalibration. That is a fast timeline, he said eventually. Even by standards that I am increasingly realizing I do not understand. Saris did not correct him. She did not soften the implication. Delays reduce probability of success, she said. Ethan nodded once. Of course they do, he replied, as if that explained everything and nothing at the same time. He shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply adjusting to the fact that the ground beneath him had changed in a way that was not physical. And the other part, he added, glancing back at the projection where his name remained highlighted with an attention he had never requested, the part where this involves your royal structure. He paused, choosing the word carefully. I assume that is not a private process. For the first time since he had entered the chamber, something in Saris's gaze altered by a measurable degree, not emotion exactly, but acknowledgement of a factor that existed beyond pure logic. No, she said. The single word carried enough weight to answer the question fully. Ethan exhaled softly. Right, he said. Public. The concept settled in his mind with a clarity that felt oddly more challenging than the rest of it. Systems, projections, compatibility, those were problems he could categorize. Public recognition was something else entirely. It meant observation. It meant expectation. It meant that whatever decision had been made here would not remain contained within this room, but would expand outward into a structure far larger than either of them. He rubbed the back of his neck lightly, a habit he had never managed to eliminate, and let out a quiet breath that bordered on a laugh without fully committing to it. I usually prefer my responsibilities to involve fewer witnesses, he admitted. Sarah stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough to re-establish the center of the conversation, her presence steady in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Preference does not alter necessity, she said. Ethan nodded again, this time with a small, resigned tilt of his head. You are very consistent on that point, he said. A faint shift in the ambient light passed through the chamber, and for a brief moment the projections dimmed, as if the system had decided the discussion phase was concluding and the execution phase was beginning. Ethan noticed it. Of course he did. He noticed systems when they changed behavior. Something just moved, he said, more to himself than to her. Yes, Saris replied. Preparations have begun. The simplicity of the statement carried an implication that landed more heavily than anything else so far. This was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Ethan let that settle, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to her, and when he spoke again his tone had shifted, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. Then I should probably meet the person this actually affects, he said. Saris regarded him for a moment, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharper now, as if the question itself had passed. A threshold. You will, she said. Ethan waited, sensing there was more, and the silence that followed confirmed it. Somewhere beyond the chamber, distant but unmistakable, a subtle change rippled through the structure, a reorientation of movement, of attention, of purpose. The palace, if that was what it was, had begun to respond. Saris inclined her head slightly, a gesture so minimal it might have gone unnoticed anywhere else, but here it carried the quiet authority of transition. She is already on her way, she said. The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not analytical, not procedural, but personal in a way that had been absent until now. Ethan straightened slightly, not out of formality, but because something in the moment required it, his mind shifting gears once more, moving from abstract systems and projections to a single, very specific reality. He let out a quiet breath, steadying himself in a way that felt almost automatic. All right, he said softly. Then I suppose this is the part where things become real. And for the first time since the conversation began, the silence that followed was not controlled by data or decisions, but by anticipation. The chamber did not announce her arrival, but it adjusted for it, a subtle recalibration of light and space that made Ethan aware of the moment before he actually saw her. It was not dramatic. Nothing here ever was. The doors at the far end opened with the same quiet precision as everything else, and for a brief second, no one moved, as if the room itself had decided to acknowledge the transition before allowing it to continue. She entered without hesitation, her pace steady, controlled, not rushed and not delayed, as though time had already aligned itself with her presence. Princess Lyra Valen did not look toward Ethan immediately. Her attention moved first to Saris, a brief, silent exchange passing between them that did not require words, something practiced, something understood, and then, only then, did her gaze shift. It landed on Ethan with a focus that felt different from anything he had experienced so far, not analytical like the system, not decisive like Saris, but searching, as if she were confirming something she had not expected to find. Ethan straightened slightly, not out of formality, but because the moment demanded it, his posture adjusting in a way that was almost automatic. He met her gaze, held it, then gave a small nod, the kind he would offer anyone when introductions were unclear but unavoidable. I assume you have been informed, Lyra said, her voice measured, calm, but carrying a clarity that suggested she did not often repeat herself. Ethan considered that for a moment, then exhaled lightly. In stages, he replied, some of them more surprising than others. A faint shift touched her expression, not quite amusement, but not entirely neutral either, like a reaction she chose not to complete. She stepped closer, closing part of the distance between them, and Ethan became aware of the way the space adjusted again, attention narrowing, the environment itself seeming to focus. You are the one they selected, she said. It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. That appears to be the current conclusion, he said. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her long silver-toned ears angled slightly forward, mirroring Ceres in a way that made the connection between them unmistakable. You do not seem concerned, she observed. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. I am concerned, he said. I am also aware that concern does not seem to be influencing the outcome. That, apparently, was the correct answer. Something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest a recalibration, a subtle adjustment of expectation. She turned slightly towards Ceres, then back to Ethan, the movement smooth, controlled, deliberate. This decision was not made lightly, she said. Ethan glanced briefly at Ceres, then returned his attention to Lyra. I did not assume it was, he replied. A silence followed, but it was not empty. It carried weight, observation, something forming beneath the surface of the exchange that had not yet reached the point of expression. Then Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter this time, but no less precise. Do you understand what this means? She asked. Ethan paused, considering the question more seriously than any that had come before, his gaze drifting for a moment before returning to hers. I understand that it changes everything, he said. I understand that I was not part of this system yesterday, and that I am very much part of it now. He hesitated, then added, the rest, I am still working through. Lyra held his gaze, searching again, and, for the first time, something softer moved through her expression, not weakness, not hesitation, but recognition of a reality that extended beyond data and projections. She nodded once, a small, controlled motion that seemed to settle something unspoken. That is sufficient, she said. The chamber remained still, but the tension within it had shifted, no longer centered on the decision, but on what would follow it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing by a fraction, not because the situation had become easier, but because it had become clearer. He glanced once more between Ceres and Lyra, the two figures anchoring the moment from different directions, and let out a quiet breath that bordered on a laugh without fully becoming one. All right, he said. Then I suppose we proceed. And somewhere in the structure beyond the chamber, something larger than all three of them finalized its alignment, as if the future had just accepted its new parameters. The transition from decision to action was subtle, but unmistakable, like a system shifting from simulation to execution without announcing the moment it crossed the line. The chamber doors opened again, not with urgency, but with purpose, and this time the figures who entered did not hesitate at the threshold. Officials, attendants, and silent observers moved into position with a precision that suggested long practice, their presence filling the space without disrupting it, as though they had always been part of the room and were only now becoming visible. Ethan watched them for a second longer than he intended, then let out a quiet breath. That was fast, he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry, but clear enough that it did not need to. Ceres did not turn. Efficiency reduces error, she replied. Ethan nodded once. Of course it does. He shifted slightly, adjusting to the fact that the room was no longer centered on a conversation, but on a process, one that had begun moving forward with a momentum that did not depend on his understanding of it. Lyra stepped closer to the center of the chamber, her posture composed, her expression controlled, but Ethan noticed the small details now, the way her shoulders settled just a fraction lower, the way her gaze lingered half a second longer than before, as if the reality of the moment had finally caught up with the logic behind it. He respected that. It felt human, even if everything else about this situation did not. A raised platform emerged from the floor, its surface smooth and reflective, responding to some unseen command, and the projections shifted again, no longer displaying probabilities or forecasts, but protocols, sequences, confirmations that aligned themselves in quiet order. Ethan glanced at it, then back at Saris. I assume this is the part where I am expected to stand in a very specific place, he said. Saris inclined her head slightly. Yes. He exhaled softly, a faint trace of humor threading through the tension. It is reassuring that some things remain predictable. He stepped forward, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with the steady motion of someone who had accepted that the situation was real whether he felt prepared for it or not. The platform adjusted as he approached, subtle shifts in light guiding his position until it decided he was exactly where he needed to be. Ethan looked down briefly, then back up, his expression settling into something calm, grounded, the same look he wore when a machine failed, and he had no choice but to fix it. Around him, the room grew quieter, not because people had stopped moving, but because everything had aligned into a single focus. Sarah stepped forward then, her presence anchoring the moment, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the chamber without rising above its natural tone. Witness, she said. The word did not echo, but it spread, settling into the space with a weight that turned attention into something tangible. Ethan felt it, the shift from observation to acknowledgement, from private decision to public reality. He glanced once toward Lyra, meeting her gaze again, and this time there was no searching in it, only clarity, the same kind he had seen in Saris, but shaped differently, less absolute, more aware of what it meant. He gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just enough to say that he understood as much as he could in this moment. Then he looked forward again. Saris's voice continued, steady, precise, outlining the framework of what had already been decided, the language formal but the intent unmistakable. Ethan did not follow every term, but he did not need to. The structure was clear. The direction was clear. The outcome had been clear from the moment his name appeared in that projection. He let out one last quiet breath, the kind that marked the end of hesitation rather than the beginning of action, and adjusted his stance by a fraction, aligning himself with the space, with the process, with the future that had somehow found him in a maintenance bay and refused to let go. And somewhere beyond the chamber, beyond the palace, beyond even the system that had first identified him, something older, something embedded in layers of history no one fully understood, responded, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet recognition that felt less like a reaction and more like a confirmation that the right sequence had finally been activated.